if we don't find the political will as people who value the life-giving properties of the natural world, and by extension, the ability of humans to flourish, because the two things go hand in hand. Those of us who see that connection between a flourishing natural environment and human well-being, if we don't forcefully push that message out onto the world, we will end up in an even more dystopian situation than we are in today.
Welcome, Wild Ones. This is Josh Schlossberg, host of the Green Root Podcast, the official podcast of Eco Integrity Alliance, where we're on a quest to uncover the roots of the ecological crisis. This episode, I'd like to welcome Karen Breslin. Karen is an attorney, university professor of political science, former policy advisor for the National Park Service's Intermountain region, and former journalist. As a public interest attorney, Breslin has represented community, environmental, and animal protection organizations. She has a lot of degrees, which I won't read. She won a bunch of awards, which are also important, but I won't read. But what I will say is Karen is a Democratic candidate running for the U.S. Senate from Colorado. So welcome to the Green Root Podcast, Karen.
Well, thank you, Josh, for having me. I really do appreciate it. And this topic is near and dear to my heart, so I'm especially glad to be able to talk about it.
Yeah, I'm really happy you're here. And just an official disclaimer up front, Eco Integrity Alliance doesn't endorse political candidates, but we do talk to them, and any of them are welcome to come on the Green Root podcast. But Karen was gracious enough to accept that. And yeah, basically, the way that Karen came on my radar here in Colorado working on public lands is mostly through what our listeners are well aware of is the quote, Fix Our Forests Act. You have to use the quotes, otherwise you fall into their propaganda. We often call it F Our Forests here in not very PC way, but she has spoken out a little bit about that. And we have our senator here in Colorado who has proposed a companion bill in the Senate to move forward, Fix Our Forests. Many of us have been telling him, you got to kill this bill. Instead, he's like, no, I'm going to do a version that's just slightly less terrible. Not going to get into all the details again, unless Karen wants to do that. But it is clear that many of us believe that this is one of the worst pieces of legislation, probably for a couple decades, since George W. Bush's 2003 so-called Healthy Forest Restoration Act. Basically, it's using the Trojan horse of wildfire pretense logging to get into our public lands. Anyway, that's just my perspective on it. Karen, I'd love to hear what you think about that bill and Hickenlooper's support or creation of it.
Yeah, well, I share that perspective 100%. And when a Democrat starts carrying water for a Republican initiative and tries to dust it off and make it something that it's not, we should all be outraged and angered by that. And that is how I feel, outraged and angered. His record on environmental issues is a large part of why I am so passionate about opposing him and trying to unseat him out of the Senate. We don't need another Republican in the Senate, and we certainly don't need a Republican representing the state of Colorado and selling our natural resources down the river for political favor. And that's what I think it is. I think Hickenlooper is a corporate Democrat through and through. And if this were the 1980s, he'd probably be a Republican. He believes in this idea of public-private partnership, which is, I was a journalist. I covered public policy issues, largely environmental ones, in the 1980s and into the 1990s. And what I knew from that era was that capitalism had a new game plan. And the game plan was to encourage government officials to think that they could pair up and do things together and create great change that way. And, you know, the foolishness of this endeavor becomes obvious pretty quickly, and the rhetoric around it starts to decline. But Hickenlooper's still on that bandwagon. And, you know, this is beneficial in terms of securing corporate support, I would guess. But I think more to the point for him, I think he genuinely believes that corporations are the answer to the problems of our country. And I have a completely opposite perspective about that. And I'm not anti-capitalist. My family had a small business. I'm a lawyer. I have a law firm. I have a small business. So, capitalism in its purest form is useful and helpful. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about monopoly capitalism. We're talking about control of gigantic corporations over all aspects of American life. And Hickenlooper does not seem to have any concern about that and seems, in fact, to be a bit of a cheerleader for that. And so Fix Our Forests, and I like your renaming of it much better, is just a manifestation of that, is just further evidence of kind of the Democratic Party's capitulation to corporate interests. And then because there's a D behind somebody's name, Republicans are awful on the environment. So you kind of assume that a Democrat's going to be better than a Republican, but no, not always. And that is in large measure how I feel about this bill. And I can go on, but I'll take pauses.
No, that's great. And that's really helpful for you to outline all that. So some of us have been calling Hickenlooper Hickenlogger, but people have been calling him Frackenlooper for quite some time. So do you have anything to say about what some would claim to be his coziness with the fossil fuel industry?
It's funny because by my personality, I don't love judging people. That's not who I am. Like, I don't like the whole holier than thou, I got things right and everybody else has got it wrong sort of perspective. That's not who I am inside. But I have to tell you, running against Hickenlooper is much easier than I would expect it to be. Well, really, it's why I'm running against him, is he seems to have no compass for, sort of the public good. And or he is so deluded about what the public good is that he doesn't understand that there's a conflict. And the fracking situation is an example of that. When he was governor of Colorado, he sued two municipalities to halt their local fracking bans and regulations. And, that's pretty appalling stuff. And so the state essentially forces fracking on local communities that want to resist that. And I worked with an organization called Community Environment Legal Defense Fund, CELDEF. And CELDEF has been representing and supporting communities that try to resist environmentally hazardous and damaging activities like fracking and concentrated animal fuel, animal feedlots, and those sorts of things. And these are communities that have a lot at stake. Obviously, they want to maintain their quality of life, they want to maintain their health, and they can't rely on the state to do it. And so they try to take matters in their own hands, which you would think you would be able to do in a democratic society. And then Hickenlooper comes along and says, no, you can't. And and the courts back him up because state law generally will preempt local law in almost all cases. Now, in addition, Hickenlooper, and people don't necessarily remember this, but there was a ballot initiative, and I'm not going to get my years right, but somewhere around 2014, I think it was, maybe later. There was a ballot initiative to create greater environmental protection at the state level. And Jared Polis was actually bankrolling that.
Our governor of
Yes, our current
Colorado.
governor.
Yeah.
And it was surprising and um, inspiring to me that this was moving forward as a ballot initiative because it seemed to be really putting into the state constitution some real concern about Colorado's natural environment. And it has a lot of support according to the polling. And Polis pulls his money out of it in a deal between him and Hickenlooper. And Hickenlooper basically promises to do a commission to deal with concerns about local concerns about oil and gas operations. And on the strength of that, this ballot initiative goes away. And then Polis subsequently becomes governor. There's another effort to derail what the people want. And then my other example of Hickenlooper in this regard is, and again, I'm not going to remember the years, but I worked on a friend of the court brief for the Colorado Community Rights Group that was a statewide organization trying to protect local communities and their environmental laws. And the statewide initiative was to make it more difficult for the Colorado Constitution to be amended. And so who are the leading people behind this? The real estate industry, because there was some growth bans that were being kicked around by local communities. The restaurant industry, because there was minimum wage requirements that were being discussed at the local level. And wait for it, the fossil fuel industry, because of the local initiatives on oil and gas development. And Hickenlooper uses his office as governor to side with the industries against the grassroots organizations that oppose this effort. And my heavens, I mean, it's hard enough for grassroots organizations to create any political change. I mean, I've been around organizations trying to do this work. I've tried to support them with my law degree. And you know, it is a monumental climb, and litigation takes forever. And then when you're trying to do organizing to get things on the ballot, I mean, that's an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. And if all of that weren't enough, right, then we've got to weight the scales even further against that Democratic initiative. And so anyone who cares about the environment, I'm just going to be super blunt right now, anybody who cares about the natural world should not be voting for John Hickenlooper. And that isn't to say that he can't at times do things that are good for the environment, like, you know, protecting certain lands and things like that. Yes. But is that enough? Is that what we really need right now at this particular ecological moment in our history? For me, it's not near enough. And when you add all of the destructive things that he supports, like this Fix Our Forest thing, to me, it's a no-brainer that if you care about the environment, he's not your guy.
Yeah, I appreciate that information. And actually, I was going to ask you about it, and I'm pretty sure this is the same thing. It's the Amendment 71. So that's
Yes.
the thing that, so when I had first moved into Colorado, which was in 2014, and I wasn't really politically active yet, and I'd heard about this, the idea that we're going to make it more difficult for people to do citizen initiatives, which to me is pretty much the last part of legitimate democracy we have in many ways in the United States. People can not just, oh, just vote for this politician or whatever. It's like we have an idea that we think should be enshrined in law. Let's get enough people to support it through signatures. We get it on the ballot, and then people can vote. I think that's, to me, one of the most worthwhile things. And then they actually curtailed that to a certain degree, made it more difficult. And I don't think it got the attention it deserved at the time. I was hearing about it. I was like, this sounds like a huge deal. And certainly there were people speaking out against it. But yeah, I think that's been forgotten, and that's upsetting. And the fact that apparently he was governor at the time, I believe, when that happened, that's on his shoulders. And I would say that's almost more egregious than Fix Our Forest, because that I could understand how, politically speaking, he could massage that and make that look good. But I don't know how to have made that other thing look good. So thank you for pointing that out.
Well, the logic was that the Colorado Constitution is burdened with a lot of stuff. But that's for the voters to decide, in my view. Okay, if there's too much there, that's on us as voters because we put a lot in there. And maybe that should be a lesson for the General Assembly, that they ought to be taking actions on things that the voters care about rather than relying on constitutional amendments as a way to achieve that. And so, and people bought that because they bought that logic, like, well, it is really complicated and maybe it should be harder. But you know, at the end of the day, it really was about squelching democracy. And that's just what's the main thing that people complain about our political system. As a political science professor, my sense is people don't believe it's very democratic anymore in the small d sort of way. And yet, you know, measures like this are designed to make it even less so. And one of the things that, you know, from my work working with community groups and other organizations trying to, you know, just do some grassroots activism by using the courts, it is unbelievably difficult. And it takes a tremendous amount of their time and energy. It's practically another full-time job for people who are really engaged in trying to create some kind of a significant policy change by challenging something that the government has done. And I'll just tell you this, because I think this is particularly outrageous. The Colorado legislature, it's now a little over a year old, but they enacted a statute that essentially, let me try to say this well, because it's somewhat complicated. If there's a land use decision before a local government, and that land use decision would result in dense housing, if you oppose that land use decision for whatever reason and you lose, then you have to pay the attorney's fees of the local government. Now, there are very few circumstances where the losing party has to pay attorney's fees. So the Colorado General Assembly carved out a brand new exception for people trying to challenge dense housing developments. Now, here's the cherry on that particular sundae. If you are an advocate for that housing project and the local government turns it down, then you don't have to pay.
Well, it's interesting that you bring that up because that is getting to the heart of what my perspective is, and others I've been talking to see as why a lot of things are becoming very anti-environmental in Colorado, or maybe continuing to be, or whatever. No offense to real estate agents, and obviously we all need to live in a house, but I feel as if the push for the endless growth in Colorado, which is largely about building new houses, is behind a lot of the anti-environmental stuff, whether it's wildlife or forests or across the board, fossil fuels. And what we're noticing with what we call wildfire pretense logging, this Trojan horse of, if you just say the word wildfire, you can log anywhere you want, is it's being done at the behest of developers who want to keep pushing further and further into the forest, into the fire plane, which will burn eventually, no matter how many trees you cut down. And then it's sort of like this psychological buffer. It's like, oh, well, we did this thing, even though we didn't really. Maybe this will encourage more growth. So that's my take of how all of this ties into it. I would be interested in hearing a rebuttal to that, or any thoughts. What do you think about how central is this push for more building, more growth, more whatever in Colorado to its, what I would call its strong anti-environmental policy?
Yeah, thank you for surfacing that. Because I've been around here long enough. I've been here since the late 1960s, and I've only been away for a relatively small number of years. So Colorado's been my home, and I've seen these boom development situations where we just have so many new houses going up and so many parts of the metro area expanding exponentially. And I think this might be my third iteration of that, maybe only two. The last one was the really big one. The last time was in the 80s, and now. Yes, I agree with you completely that whatever sensibility, it's hard to remember that Colorado was once the state that turned down the Olympics on environmental grounds. Once upon a time, we cared enough about the environment that we said no to the Olympics. It's even hard to remember that Governor Romer in the 1990s came up with the concept of smart growth. Now, I don't love that concept conceptually because to me it's an oxymoron, but but nevertheless, he did surface the idea that growth needs to be managed and thought about in some kind of a systemic way. And we don't talk about that anymore. And then we used to think a little bit about the water supply, like where's all the water for all of this growth going to come from? And we don't really have that conversation anymore either. And I know the good folks at, Save the Rivers, they're trying very hard to fight these battles. But, I worked on Colorado River issues for the National Park Service. And, it's just math that doesn't add up. There's just not enough water to go around. And yet we pretend that this is going to be okay. And the only way it can be okay is to destroy what remains of the existing rivers and to do even more damage to the Colorado River. And so Hickenlooper presides over the Colorado Water Plan. And I can't find in there any language about, oh, we really actually don't have enough water to do all of this. Like there seems to be no recognition of this. And, I don't know how far conservation can get us, because my sense is it can't get us that far because agriculture is such a primary user of water. But it's very clear that water is going to be an issue for residential purposes as well, and already is. And, to your point, we're not having the kinds of conversations that we need to have statewide about how to protect what's special about Colorado. The conversation we're having is there's not enough housing, let's build lots more. We're not thinking about how this is going to affect wildfire risk for the people who move into these communities. I'm in a wildfire risk sort of situation. I'm on about 3 acres in Elbert County. My property buttresses some forest land. Mostly I'm in open land. We're at risk here. but they're building thousands of homes all across the Southwest metro area, all across up north. And, those are wildfire zones. And so are we having those conversations? What kind of buffers need to be put in place? What kind of mitigation measures should developers be footing the bill for some kind of wildfire mitigation strategy? We're not doing any of that, not to mention the water issues. So I agree completely. It's not a lot that I can affect as a US Senator, except as it relates to federal lands policy and those sorts of things. But we as a state, we're headed. When I first moved here, you'd find signs, big like handmade banners and sometimes some billboard style signs. Don't Californicate Colorado. We are so on our way to that. We are so far down that road. It's heartbreaking to me. And yet, who's speaking up about that? So yes, and the Democratic Party has not been thoughtful about these issues at all.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. The watershed issue, no question, water is one of the most precious assets in the arid West, and we're pretending like nothing's nothing's wrong. I think there is this denial, this psychological deep denial, and it's around the wildfire thing. So we both acknowledge wildfire and sometimes even get, hyperbolic about it. But the first thing should be, okay, well, maybe let's stop busting new homes into the fire plane. That's like the last thing on the agenda. It's not even on the agenda. Up here in Nederland, where I live literally adjacent to national forest. I can throw a stick and it hits the national forest, like no exaggeration. And they want to do all this logging up here, even though they did tons of it already, which knocked all this woody debris on the ground. It opened it up to wind, it dried it out. They want to bust through roads, including through old growth, because they think they need more access, which I think could be debated. But what's ironic and no one's talking about is like, okay, how about my neighbor just down the street? They're building a 6,000-foot mansion that they cut out of the forest, literally adjacent to public lands. All that's being done in the name of this person's property, whether it's effective or not. And I would argue what the cutting is not effective, but it's this psychological thing. Oh, okay, now it's okay for me to build a new mansion. Like, why aren't we addressing zoning? That gets very complicated, things with insurance. And frankly, I can't even speak to the details of that. But I am good at, I think, looking at root issues. And that's why I called this the Green Roots podcast. I think there's many roots. So my take is that anytime a difficult issue comes up, not only do they not get to the roots, they go to any length to avoid that. And anyone addressing the roots, they will just pursue mercilessly. And I will just take that opportunity to give a really brief pitch to this report that we just put out called Forest Fire Malfeasance. Go to forestfiremalfeasance.org. And it has emails that we got from CORA, which is Colorado Open Records Act request, where we got all these emails from our government agencies colluding with the timber industry and elected officials to privately acknowledge that, the science that advocates are bringing up around the ineffectiveness or counterproductiveness of logging, wildfire pretense logging, that's legitimate. There are those studies out there, but don't admit that publicly because it gives them a win. This is in their emails that they were sending around. They even went on to say, no, they're not cherry picking. What they're doing is they're pointing out our overpromises. They were making the argument that we were making, and they're doing it privately. And yet publicly, their whole thing is like, oh, yeah, anyone who says anything against this is not only wrong, they're a liar and they want people to burn in a fire. So we're trying to get that out right now. This is like actual collusion. And I hate to say it. I mean, this is what a conspiracy looks like. You know the legal definition of a conspiracy, just two or more people acting to move forward a particular. So, conspiracy theory, real life. But anyway, I don't want to go too far down that road. But anything you have to say about my rant?
I I I just love the approach that you're taking, and it animates really my entire political career. So I ran against Michael Bennett for very similar reasons, because I think the two of them are equally deficient on the environmental front, and
Our,
maybe not
our
even.
current senator, just for folks who don't know, our other senator, Michael Bennett. Yes.
Yeah, and I did pretty well against him without, it was more of kind of an exploratory effort on my part to just see if I could push some of these environmental concepts out into the party and what the reaction would be. And the reaction was pretty solid. I don't know if people paid that much attention to that or other parts of my platform, but I didn't really get any pushback on some of the things that I was saying. And some of what I was saying is that we need ecosystem level protection, that we shouldn't be just thinking about a particular species. We need to be thinking about the situation in a more holistic kind of way. And I spoke about things like the rights of nature. If corporations have rights, are able to go into court to assert their interests under the environmental laws, then forests and rivers and mountains, et cetera, need to as well. And this is becoming a much more widely accepted concept, but it's pivotal because standing for environmental purposes can be very difficult to achieve under the environmental statutes for various reasons. And it would give us a way of really thinking about the forest as an entity rather than as just a collection of trees. And so, I applaud what you're trying to do, because that work is near and dear to my heart and something that I've been trying to pay attention to for literally decades now. Because, and I'm sure you feel the same way. Once you start to really think more deeply about the ecological crisis, it becomes so glaringly obvious that we can't keep doing the same things. And yet somehow we keep doing the same things. And that's where we need to draw a line. We need to say just no more. Like, we cannot pretend that these natural limits don't exist. Because I think if we don't find the political will as people who value the life-giving properties of the natural world, and by extension, the ability of humans to flourish, because the two things go hand in hand. Those of us who see that connection between a flourishing natural environment and human well-being, if we don't forcefully push that message out onto the world, we will end up in an even more dystopian situation than we are in today, where the natural world is managed to within inches of its life, where it's no longer natural, it's largely, if not entirely, artificial, because we've removed all of the undergrowth. We've removed all of the things that we think don't belong. We've dammed every river and deprived that river of any natural attributes or qualities. That, the ecological systems don't function well, so we have fake things instead. We don't have wild salmon anymore. We have genetically modified salmon. We don't have corn that's grown in natural ways. We have genetically modified corn. And so if the monopolistic, technocratic, delusional interests that are running our society and our politicians continue to hold sway, future generations are going to know a natural world that is even more bereft of the diversity and beauty and life-sustaining qualities than what we have right now. And we are so far down that path now that it's shocking to me. If someone had told me as a college student in the 1980s that not only would we not actually grapple with the big environmental problems of our era, that we would exponentially make them worse over the next 40 years, I would not have believed it. But I've watched it. I've watched it unfold in real time. And some of it is the connection of corporate cash to the political system. They've got them all tightly controlled there. But there's multiple things that are contributing to it. And so, I really applaud what you're trying to do, because it's absolutely essential to giving future generations any kind of a quality of life. And our quality of life is not derived from the screens. We know that. We've got high levels of depression and anxiety, and our young people don't know what to do with themselves. And, but I see out your window, you've got some beautiful natural places to spend time in. And isn't it shocking that the very thing that gives human existence meaning and comfort and support are the very things that are being systematically destroyed right now at a time when we need them more than ever. And that's what makes me so angry about something like Hickenlooper's bill. I mean, and I don't think it's hyperbolic to call it ecocidal. And I don't think it's hyperbolic to even call it misanthropic, because it is fundamentally contrary to what we as humans need to thrive. It is a consistent undervaluing of nature's gifts to us, while overvaluing exploitation of all of those resources. And to me, it's sort of like walking into, a breathtaking museum of incredible works of art and looking around and thinking, let's pull those off the wall and we can probably burn them for fuel. It's got to stop.
I think that's an excellent analysis, and it's clear you know your stuff, right? I think there are a lot of wannabe politicians or politicians, they can memorize some talking points, but I can see right through that. And you have a deep level analysis of this, which I definitely appreciate. And obviously in the political realm, you gotta base your message on who you're talking to. I understand all that, but it's important to know that you do clearly have an understanding of this, I would say, ecosystem wide. And I definitely just want to say I appreciate the your depth of knowledge on that. But I don't want to keep you all day here, but I do want to broaden this a little bit beyond just Hickenlooper, who, yeah, I mean, I've never voted for him and certainly never will. And I want to make it clear, he's a Eco Integrity Alliance. We're nonpartisan, right? If Boebert wants to come out of the woodwork and all of a sudden like protect wolves, we'll pat her on the back and say thank you, and we're not holding our breath. But when Democrats do things that are harmful to the natural world, we will speak up. And I hate to say it, but most of the places I've lived have been these blue states in which it is the Democrats that are pulling the strings, and they're doing things that are just as bad and sometimes even worse. I hate to say it, on this wildfire pretense logging. I mean, we want Republicans and Democrats to agree on passing bills, like, but not like this, right? It's like come together on things that are good, but it's like they're coming together on the worst stuff. And I understand, why they're able to do it. There's a lot of propaganda out there or whatever. But I guess here's my question for you. I mean, first I could say, do you feel as if Democrats have kind of stepped away from doing real ecological advocacy? I feel like you already answered that question, right? But a deeper piece of that, assuming that that's still true for you, is why do you feel like Democrats have stepped back on environmental issues? And do you think that if their reasoning is, well, we got to be more moderate and we better not, blah, 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 do you think that that might be the opposite of a path to success, in that it's hard to even know what Democrats stand for anymore? And just saying that you're not a Republican doesn't really, float most people's boat anymore.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's a lot of good questions in that. I'm thinking about my time in the Park Service and trying to kind of formulate an answer to that question. And the Clinton administration Clinton and Obama both were deeply disappointing. And I started with the Park Service in '93. And so 25 years of watching. And I was part-time for most of my career. Actually, I think all of it, really, save for maybe a month or something. But so I was able to do all of these other things. But at one point, I was assistant regional director for planning and legislation and communications. And planning is how the parks will essentially be administered in terms of the uses. And so where visitor use occur and those sorts of things. And, it was surprising to me how often park superintendents would come in with a proposal that did not prioritize protection of park resources. And it was difficult for the Park Service to resist those kinds of efforts. Well, we need to expand the parking lot, or we need a new campground here, we need to expand the visitor center, those sorts of things. And the first time I went to Old Faithful and saw the shopping mall that had been installed there, that's, to me, that was appalling. Like, one of the great national natural wonders of the world, and we've turned it into this completely developed thing. I wasn't party to any of those decisions. That predated me, I presume, or maybe I just wasn't in the mix. But my point here is that even an agency that is theoretically set up to protect the natural world is still torn by that dual mission of for the enjoyment of the public, but it also says future generations. And my analysis was always, we have to keep our eye on that particular piece of the puzzle. But it was extraordinarily difficult because sometimes, park superintendents, I think, felt like if they could preside over a new facility of some sort that would solve a particular problem, that would be an important legacy for them. I don't know. But I was surprised by how often those kinds of policy or projects came forward for us. And I, as often as I could, advocated against them. I mean, sometimes such things like that are necessary, don't get me wrong. But I was always asking the hard questions about that and whether they were necessary. And I think that, you're tuned into the root cause analysis. And I honestly think that we as a society have not really yet understood that our well-being is connected to the natural world. I think that's really a lot of it. And so you can be a Bennett or a Hickenlooper, and somebody can come to you and say, if we just cut down all those trees, the forest fires won't be nearly so severe. And we can do some logging, and that'll be good for the logging industry, and they'll be on board. And because we're reducing the fire severity, or we think we are, or we can say we are, then that's going to be politically saleable to the communities in the mountains and places that, are concerned about wildfire. And we can throw in some grant money to help communities too. So that'll be a win. And, doesn't this make sense as a good bipartisan effort? Well, for all the reasons you've already said, it doesn't make sense. And yet you'd have to think more deeply about the problem. What really is the problem here? Well, it's got something to do with development in places that are fire prone. And then it has something to do with how we actually protect the developments from that fire. But let's not ask any of those questions. Let's just do the thing that seems expedient. So I think some of it is just not understanding that ecological issues are systemic issues and cannot be addressed in a vacuum. And that's how I see fix our forests. Like, okay, you cut down those trees, but you don't really understand the ecological consequences of that, another 5, 10, 20, 50 years down the road. And my guess is the ecological consequences are that forest is not going to ever recover from that. It will never be what it once was. And that tells me too, that it is not going to be more fire resilient. It will be less fire resilient. And yet we're not thinking in those kinds of timeframes. So, to me, the root cause analysis requires thinking about future generations, the way native traditions, native peoples do, is what's going to happen down the road. It's thinking about how all the pieces of the puzzle fit together rather than in isolation. And it requires really, and this is the most difficult part of all, it requires asking hard questions about whether exponential growth, GDP growth, can exist alongside a healthy natural environment. And I think the answer is pretty clear that it can't. That doesn't mean that we can't have human well-being. I think we have to have human well-being. I think that the pro-growth mania is actually antithetical to human well-being. I mean, who among us is benefited by endless consumption? I mean, none of us are. And yet it's sort of the message of how we live our lives. This is what makes our lives. And again, I'm old enough to remember when a certain level of consumption was deemed adequate, and now not so much. And you can just look at the sizes of our houses. You go through older suburbs and they look like this in the 60s and the 80s. I'm in an 80s house now. It's about 1,400 square feet, standard issue, multi or a single family home. And then you look at the houses that they're building 3 miles from me out in the open plains, and they're at least double this size for a comparable size family. So why is that? We treat everything as if it's inconsequential. So instead of repurposing, there's a fairly attractive commercial office space sort of building out in an open area in South Metro Denver. It's a really attractive building and huge. And they're tearing it down to building another one. So all of the resources that were pulled out of the earth to produce that thing, all of that goes, maybe some of it can be recycled, but you figure the pollution that goes into tearing it down, the fossil fuel use, and then the management of the waste, and then the new materials that will be brought on site, just things like that. Like we treat it all as if there's an endless supply of it. And, everything we consume is, if we buy a vacuum cleaner, maybe it lasts 2 years if we're lucky. Just the disposability society that we live in, that nothing needs to last and nothing needs to have any quality because we'll just go get another one. All of these things are related to, I think, a broken and dysfunctional relationship with the natural world, and a lack of understanding that we should be respectful of the natural world's limits and appreciate what the earth does for us. And instead, we're just, we're treating it like kind of a cash register and a landfill at the same time. We'll just pull stuff out and dump stuff back onto it. And it's a complex set of ecological systems. And we need to elevate that understanding of the natural world into the mainstream political discourse. And it just hasn't happened because it's antithetical to that pro-growth mantra that politicians are so obsessed with.
I think that's very well put. I think you stated that quite eloquently and hit a lot of points that I think are extremely important to get out to the world. So I guess last question I would ask you here, and I'll let you go, is I would say there's no question that advocating for these things as a potential elected official is the right thing to do. I would say there's just no question. Do you feel as if advocating for, call it ecological integrity, whatever you want to call it, is a detriment, a harm to somebody trying to get into public office? Or do you think if properly put out there, it could actually be a boon because it can set Democrats apart from Republicans? It can set candidates apart from those who are just greenwashing and pretending to care. What do you think?
Um, hmm. Well, that's a really good question. You've asked a lot of really good questions. I think that intuitively, large numbers of us understand that things can't continue the way they are. I think young people in particular are feeling disaffected and alienated from what we're offering them right now. I think that the fear of climate change has unfortunately been repurposed to serve ecological destruction, and that it's going to be hard to undo the message that the problem we have ecologically is just climate change and not everything else. Because for me, climate change is a symptom of many other things. It's not the only problem, that if we could just solve the problem of carbon in the atmosphere, all would be well. No. Number one, we can't solve it that simply. But number two, it's emblematic of this dysfunctional relationship that we have. So I think that beginning to ask people the kinds of questions that were being asked in the 70s and in the late 60s when the environmental movement really came to the fore, that we can start to shift that public dialogue. And that's what I'm attempting to do with this campaign. And I don't think that, the Republicans aren't going to like it, because obviously their thing is I don't know if they literally don't have an appreciation for the natural world, or They're so convinced that their own economic interests are contrary to that way of looking at things. I'm not sure I know. I also know that there are people who are Republican who care very much about the natural world. So I think that's a mixed bag. And I hope that this message will resonate with the people who recognize, George Bush the first wanted to be the environment president. So in the early 1990s, environmental issues still had enough uh, salience that was a winning message for him, or at least he thought it was. I think we as Democrats need to start messaging that again. And we need to stop being afraid of what Republicans are going to say when we do. And that, I think, is the big failing from my perspective about why we have ended up where we are, is we as Democrats, the Democratic Party over the last 20, 30 years has been unwilling to stand against measures that are contrary to the well-being of the natural world. Now, I give the party credit, various officials for standing in favor of protecting, national monuments and doing certain things like that. But I'll give you one example of snowmobile use at Yellowstone. So Clinton waits until, he's practically out the door to control the use of snowmobiles in the winter, in Yellowstone. Now, this is an issue because the snowmobiles pollute. They pollute the ground, they pollute the air, and they disrupt, the wildlife during this time frame. And the Park Service does an EIS and says no snowmobiles in the wintertime. Bush comes in and overturns that. Okay. Obama comes in though, and does he go back to what Clinton wanted to do? No, because it became too politically, contentious. And does the Park Service stand against that? Is the Park Service able to advocate for protecting that place? No. We just live with whatever degradation occurs there. Now we can say, well, maybe the degradation wasn't actually that bad, but logically speaking, at a time when animals are at most vulnerable, that having that use is somehow going to be just fine, that sort of defies common sense. So what we're really doing is saying, well, it's okay, we can let that happen there. That's all right. And a similar situation plays out with the bison at Yellowstone, where initially the Park Service was dead set against on treating buffalo as livestock, and now it's just routine across now the Obama administration and the Biden administration, so two Democratic administrations. So I think, trying to remind people that wild animals are important, natural places are important, ecological integrity is important, human health is important. We haven't even done anything about microplastics. We've made so little progress on environmental toxins in the last 30 years or 40. And so I think that it can be a winning message again. And I think it'll be a winning message for me, because I think Coloradans still love Colorado for what it has to offer us. And I think that, it's been hard for people to see past the greenwashing of people like John Hickenlooper. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, you definitely have a really in-depth understanding of these issues for sure. And I think what you're saying is legit, to be honest. But yeah, so thank you so much. Is there any website you want to let people know if they want to find out more about your positions and platforms or to support you or whatever?
Yes, it is Breslin, Breslin, for Colorado. The word is spelled out, FOR, for Colorado.com. That's my website. And we need financial help. We absolutely do, but I would love to chat with any groups that care about these issues and can kind of elevate my messaging on this front. Right now, people are paying a lot of attention to, what we call kitchen table issues, affordability and how to get by. And I'm also messaging a lot about racial justice, which is another problem that has languished in this country for decades. And I am obviously messaging about the atrocities that Trump engages in the Republican Congress on a daily basis. But so the environmental message is getting a little bit lost because all of this other is occurring. And so I need help in getting that message out. If you've liked what I've got to say, share it with your social media followers and invite me to speak. I don't need a lot of people to talk to. I'm happy to talk to anybody, because I can't get this message out by myself. And, and Hickenlooper has such a lead. We're starting to pick up in terms of the fundraising. We didn't really try to start raising money until, I don't know, about a month ago. And we've really picked up just in the last 2 weeks. And so that's going to look a lot better, but he already has like $2 million or something. And the sad part is that the money tells people who pay attention to these things that I'm not to be bothered with. And that means that the media won't pay attention to me because I don't have money, so they don't think that I'm a real threat. And, sort of back to the whole conversation about our dysfunctional system in a grander way. And so anything that anyone can do to kind of help amplify my message would be extremely helpful. And again, Josh, I admire so much what you're trying to do because, like you said so well, we just, as a society, and politicians just gloss over the surface of all of this. And if we're going to ensure a healthy planet for future generations, we've got to get down to the root causes. So many thanks for your efforts on that front. And I'm honored to be a part of your podcast.
Well, thank you, Karen, for what you're doing. And thanks again for coming on the Green Root podcast.
Okay, thank you. Have a good day.
Too.